Finally, I'd like to highlight briefly another important way in which fiscal policy and the budget can and indeed has been used to improve well-being. There is, I think, a solid, though not uncontested, consensus that economic reforms of the past quarter of a century have played an important role in the improved performance and resilience of the Australian economy. It's less widely appreciated how the budget has often been used as a tool to help smooth the implementation of these reforms, facilitating the often difficult adjustments that accompany structural reforms. A recent OECD study on the political economy of reform commented that, and again I'll quote, one of the most robust findings to emerge from recent econometric work on the political economy of structural reform is that sound public finances tend to be associated with more reform. To put this somewhat retrospectively, of course, into our well-being framework, structural reforms have often involved increasing risk to some parts of the community in order to benefit Australian society in some aggregate sense. Other reforms that were considered desirable at an aggregate level were often considered to have undesirable distributional consequences. In many such cases, reforms were purchased by compensating losers from the budget. There's a legitimate role for using the budget in this way, with some qualifications, of course. First, the reform should be worth the cost of the compensation involved. That's pretty obvious. Second, the payments should ease rather than hinder the necessary adjustment process. That too is obvious, but rather difficult to achieve. By the early 1980s, it was clear that real wages growth had outpaced productivity growth and that was contributing to a persistently high unemployment rate. In an accord with the trade union movement, the government of the day provided income tax reductions and other social wage payments for the benefit of workers in return for real wage restraint. This allowed a sustained period of real wage moderation, which was an important factor behind the very considerable reduction in the unemployment rate late in that decade. It is late in the 1980s. Similarly, it was considered that in the absence of appropriate compensation arrangements, the introduction of the goods and services tax would have had a disproportionate adverse impact on some sectors of the community. Tax cuts and other compensation payments were used to address these distributional issues and to smooth the implementation of the reforms. A third example, an important element of the effective implementation of the national competition policy reforms in the 1990s was progressive national competition payments from the Commonwealth to the states. The rationale for these payments was that while the states were primarily responsible for the implementation of the national competition policy reforms, the benefits would be shared broadly throughout the national economy. The payments provided a way of distributing the benefits of reform in a manner that had political traction. The creative and active use of the budget in the structural reform process has made an important contribution to Australia's well-being. Let me conclude. The Whitlam government can be seen in retrospect as having been responsible for a permanent increase in the size of Australian government. There's been a lot of interest over the several decades since Whitlam in the economic consequences of larger government and the appropriate role of fiscal policy in a modern economy. Much of that interest on both sides of some quite intense debates has been ideological. But it would be fair to say that both the intensity and ideological content of the debates has abated over time. One reason for that is a growing interest in the microeconomics of the national budget. That growing interest is a good thing. Currently, it's being hampered significantly by deficiencies in measurement. Deficiencies in measuring inputs, outputs and, most importantly, outcomes. There is a need for better measurement. From a Treasury perspective, all of the micro-level detail in the spending and taxation decisions in the national budget are relevant to the well-being of Australians. They should be intended to contribute to the ability of Australians to build capabilities that would allow them to choose lives that they have reason to value. Reforms we implement today build the capacity for governments of the future to assist Australians in this way. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Dr. Henry. John Keogh from the Financial Review. Just interested in your final few comments about We need a better measurement in the budget of the microeconomic effects of some of the policy decisions. Is that something that Treasury would be pushing and keen to see?
No, I wasn't saying that we needed better measurement in the budget.
Okay.
In fact, my comments were more directed to the way that we measure outputs and outcomes at an aggregate level in the national accounts and in other indicators of economic performance. It's not that the measures in the budget are deficient. They do a pretty good, well, they may be, but not in this sense. They do a pretty good job of estimating the inputs. But my interest is in the connection between those inputs and the outcomes that are ultimately achieved. And it's in the gap between, well, the gap that exists is in our understanding of the way in which the inputs impact on outputs and then, of course, on outcomes that the policy is presumably designed to pursue. And in the speech, I gave a couple of examples of deficiencies in the measurement of outputs that somewhat hamper our ability to analyse policy interventions and their efficacy even before they're implemented.
So it would be more of a national accounts measurement, would it?
Yeah, I think so. There's quite a lot of work going on around the world at the moment that's focused on these questions. Interestingly, this is not a new perspective on national accounts. Generations of economists, ever since the national accounts were first constructed, have pointed to some of the deficiencies in measurement, particularly in the services sector, and more particularly in the area of public service provision. In more recent times, perhaps associated with a growing questioning around the world of the importance of, or the value of growth per se. I have to be very careful with my words here, but there has been a growing interest around the world in the value of growth per se. Associated with that, there's been some re-questioning. It's not new questioning, it's some re-questioning of some concerns that have been around in the economics profession, at least the academic economics profession, with several seminal contributions over the decades from several Nobel Prize-winning economists that have questioned the extent to which the national accounts provide a sufficient indicator of economic progress. The Australian Bureau of Statistics has made a major contribution internationally to addressing some of these deficiencies through its Measures of Australian Progress report. The Productivity Commission has made some contributions in particular areas in improving our understanding of the outcomes of various interventions and in addressing some of the deficiencies of gross domestic product as an indicator of economic progress. For an organisation like the Australian Treasury that is very serious about providing policy advice to government that increases the well-being of the Australian population, to the extent that those aggregate measures of progress are deficient in this respect, or indeed in several other respects that I could talk about, that's something that we have to take a keen interest in. Indeed we have. We've taken quite a strong interest in these developments and have in our own way contributed to recent international work that hopefully over time can lead to a more sophisticated set of national accounts. I've spoken here about some limitations of the national accounts in the social area. I could equally, in fact, perhaps more than equally, have referred to some deficiencies in the environmental space. There's quite a lot of interest in academic circles, but also a growing interest in policy circles in addressing some of those deficiencies of measurement.
Dr. Henry Alex Sanchez, I'm interested in two aspects of the wellbeing framework: the freedom and opportunity, and distribution.
Yeah.
And in particular, I'm interested in the challenge of poverty, and not only income poverty, but poverty of capability. And I'd be interested for your observations as to how Treasury tackling the challenge of poverty, or do you see it more generally as a responsibility of other social policy areas of government, or do you think that there is a unique Treasury perspective of how to deal with entrenched poverty in particular parts of communities, in particular parts of urban areas, etc., etc.?
Yeah. Well, I would hope that our perspective is not unique, but we certainly do have a perspective on it. It's something that we discuss quite a lot. And I guess for this reason, before coming to the question, the reason that we discuss it quite a lot is that in some areas it is difficult, I think, to argue that the poverty or the indicators of poverty that exist are simply due to the fact that governments are not throwing enough money at the problem. In some areas. And traditional measures of poverty are in fact traditional measures, usually anyway, of the shape of the tail end of an income distribution. You know, how many sit in the tail end of an income distribution. They're more they provide more of a comment on income distribution than they do on poverty per se. I'm not saying the two things are not linked. They are. I'm just saying that the link between the two things is actually quite difficult to conceptualise, and it's very, very difficult to operationalise if you're thinking about a policy intervention to address the problem. So let me give you an example. Take entrenched Indigenous disadvantage in remote communities. Now, it's probably the case, but that if we were, as a community, to put a lot more public resources, dollars, into those communities, there would be some positive impact that would be measurable over a period of time. But there are people, including people who live in those communities, who would contest that proposition. They would say that if that's all you did, you would just entrench existing problems. You would just make it even more likely that the disadvantage that we observe today will persist in an intergenerational sense. The way that we think about poverty in the Treasury these days is very much in a capability sense. So we would say, we think of poverty as capability deprivation. That is, people are in poverty if they do not have the capabilities that would allow them to choose a life of value and a life that they themselves have reason to value. People who are in that situation, who are denied those capabilities for whatever reason, are in poverty. They could be millionaires at a point in time, bankrupt the very next year with no capabilities to then choose a life that they would, or indeed that anybody else would have reason to value. Society might not want to extend a helping hand to such a person, but you might. There are also many people in Australia of whom it could not be said that they don't have an adequate income to put food on the table, they don't have an adequate income to afford housing in some parts of Australia, but nevertheless, despite that income, they are capability deprived. If you go into any remote Indigenous community anywhere in Australia, it doesn't take long to stumble across somebody who is capability deprived, and usually the capability deprivation is multidimensional, and usually it's not as simple as being income deprived. I went to a remote Indigenous community in Western Australia a couple of years ago, and I found children playing a game with $1 and $2 coins, tossing $1 and $2 coins into gaps in the pavement. That was the currency of their game, literally $1 and $2 coins. Should I have concluded from that those kids were not capability deprived? There were about 70 kids in the quadrangle, 3 adults. The adults were off at the races, I discovered. They'd walked for several days to the horse races. The kids were there on their own. I take the view that those kids were capability deprived. They weren't in school and it was a school day. It was just one example. When I inquired further, I was told that the average number of people living in houses in a house in that community was 15. That was the average number of people living in the 3-bedroom house. For that reason, those kids are capability deprived. That's a perspective that in the Treasury we take to this issue of poverty. We see poverty in terms of capability deprivation. And I would suggest that for people interested in designing policy interventions, that's a much more sensible way to think of poverty than poverty in terms of income inequality alone, even though income inequality is an issue that's important for its own sake.
You talked at the end about Peter Martin, the Age and Herald. You talked at the end about compensating losers to purchase reforms. You talked about the Accord, you talked about the National Competition Policy, you talked about the GST, and immediately I was thinking CRPS. Now, is that an example of what you're talking about? And if so, I guess, is it you defending that as a worthwhile thing to do? Is big compensation in order to get something through worthwhile in that case? Well, I suppose as an advisor you'd think it would be, but does it fall into that category?
Yes, it does, Peter. And actually it's not a bad illustration. The point of the carbon pollution reduction scheme, like any emissions trading scheme, is to change relative prices. Of course it changes absolute prices as well, but the point is to change relative prices. The point of the scheme itself is not to reduce the purchasing power or to reduce the real income of the people that we want to see where we want to see behavioural change. Thus, the construction of the CPRS in a way that changes relative prices but then gives back to households in particular, and also others, but gives back to households in particular the ability to sustain their real purchasing power, that sort of policy in concept makes sense. And indeed, and perhaps more importantly for the proponents of such a policy, without some form of compensation to maintain the real purchasing power of Australian households, it's extremely unlikely that such a policy proposal would gain political traction.
Miriam Lyons from the Centre for Policy Development. I am curious about whether or not you think that the CPRS passes the two tests that you said such compensation payments need to pass. That is, that the level of compensation is worth the value of the reform, given a 5% target, and that the payments should ease rather than hinder the transition and be designed in that way. That's one question. A second question was whether you think that the advice from the Sarkozy-Stiglitz report of producing national balance sheets is worth taking on board. So the idea that we actually produce national accounts that take a sort of assets and liabilities approach to broader measures of progress. So taking into account environmental, human capital, etc.
Yeah, I'm going to duck the first question. Make no apology for that. I imagine the legislation to which you're referring is presently being debated in the Senate. So I think I've got a good reason to duck the question. Anyway, be that as it may, the second question is for me rather more interesting. And my answer to the second question is yes. I think there is a strong case for developing national balance sheets. This is not easy work. I referred earlier to some economists, even in the early days of the national accounts, pointing to deficiencies in the national accounts, and even in those early days, this is one of the deficiencies to which they pointed, that there is no obvious link between our income statement and a national balance sheet, and of course there should be. As just one example, if a naturally occurring resource is sold, GDP records in that year in which it's sold the full value of the natural resource. I don't know, if that natural resource were occurring in your backyard and you sold the natural resource, you'd probably be reluctant to regard all of that natural resource as income in the year in which you sold it. You'd probably think that you'd sold an asset, and you'd probably, on your balance sheet, record two transactions. Cash had gone up, at least until you spend it, but your holdings of natural resources had fallen by presumably an amount of equal value. This is a challenging concept, of course, for an economy that has a relatively high endowment of naturally occurring resources. It's a challenging concept, but I think it's an important concept. We need to get our heads around this.
Eric Sidoti from the Whitlam Institute. It's a slightly different question in the sense that it seems to me a conclusion of much of what you're saying is that we have a much more complex policy formation process. If we're talking about capabilities and the relationship between the national balance sheet and what's happening with the fiscal operations. And given the Moran review for public service, I was just wondering if there's changes that you foresee in the way policy is formed to ensure that Treasury, in its considerations, given the perspective you outline, is both informed by and inputs into other policy type of development.
I can't give a complete answer to that question. That's quite a deep question, which I haven't thought sufficiently about, and I'm involved myself in that review to which you refer, which would limit me in any event. But I'll make a couple of observations. The first is that I have found, this is a personal reflection, I have found that whenever I have got involved in thinking about policy challenges in terms of building human capability, the very first thing I've done is to get in an aeroplane and go somewhere and talk to people on the ground. I think that's instructive. I don't think that's just a coincidence. I think that is actually quite instructive. I think there is something in that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that for an agency like mine, which sits at the centre of government, we're called a central agency, nothing can be prosecuted well, even in the policy development space, before you get to implementation. Even in the policy development space, nothing could be prosecuted well without a lot of involvement of other agencies in government, horizontal level involvement in policy development. And I've observed this of Treasury people. When we have got involved in Indigenous development issues, and we've got involved in education, we've got involved in health, in those three areas in particular, my people involved in those things spend an awful lot of time in other government agencies talking to what we call the line departments, and also in some areas talking to the policy implementation or delivery agencies about the way that things are working on the ground. So I think it does mean that central agencies that are committed to policy improvement in these areas, traditionally the responsibility of line agencies, they have to be prepared to roll their sleeves up, and they have to be prepared to go and talk to the people in the line agencies and the people on the ground who are affected by the decisions that are being taken. And that is, well, let me put it this way, that's probably not the sort of work that I would have seen myself doing when I first joined the Treasury a quarter of a century ago. Even then, there would have been instances of this behaviour to point to.